Hello, everyone. Thank you very much to the social science community for the reef for having us here. I acknowledge the Gimoy Wallabara Yidiju peoples, the traditional owners of the land on which we gathered today. And I'm very grateful to be here because this part of the world is my home. Today, I'll offer some insight into a project that I've had the absolute pleasure of working on together with Kerrie Foxwell-Norton. In the feminist embrace of oral history, our project aims to ground new knowledge on the reef in women's voices. I'll draw from just a few of their stories to speak of individual yet often shared life experiences of care, of struggle, and the consequences of finding one's gender a liability. On that note, among seafarers, fishers are known as the kingpins of superstition. If, on the way to a boat, they see a person with red hair, it's said to bring bad luck. Don't bring bananas on board, don't eat anything before the first fish is caught, and never count your fish until the day is done. Coral scientist and museum curator Carden Wallace encountered such rituals back in the 1970s. When I first started organising field trips to the Great Barrier Reef, she says, I was living in Brisbane. I used to have to drive up to Townsville in the museum Falcon and go onto the wharves and try and find somebody whose boat we could go out on. It was bad luck to have a woman on your boat. Now, Carden, who is now in her 70s, can look back and laugh at that formative experience of being a 20-something scientist, driving 1,300 kilometres up the coast, only to encounter superstition. But that's the basis we had to start from, she says, turning on the social values that construct such a plot. It's an example of just how difficult it was to organise any research, really, you know, if you're a woman in a man's world. Historians have noted a profound ignorance about the roles that women have played in Australia's past, and this takes on a particular hue, taking a cue from Kerrie's keynote this morning, here in Queensland, conservatism's stronghold in the post-war era. Analyses of the dominant historicising scripts of this state show that the rich tapestry of women's history is still largely unexplored. More, the work of tracing their historical narratives opens onto a hidden Queensland. The public story of the reef has largely been told through science, industry, and politics, and these are arenas where women have had to struggle for power, access, and visibility. And precisely because of their struggles, many women's historical influence upon and contributions to reef knowledge and protection have been hidden. We offer this project in Counterpoint, recording women's oral histories for the State Library of Queensland, that is, putting on record their contributions to reef knowledge and protection since the 1960s, really. So it's from the war to save the reef, a time that saw the confluence of feminism and environmentalism in this country, through to the much more recent coral mass coral bleaching events. Now, in drawing attention to reef history as a gendered space, our project can't help but foreground the need to look beyond traditional sources that have often neglected women's lives. Do a state library search, for example, for famous Australian environmentalists, and you'll get a list that at least and thankfully includes poet and Indigenous land rights campaigner Judith Wright. You'll also get high-profile conservationist Flick Wishart. Now, these are women whose advocacy for reef conservation warrants far wider recognition, women whose way with words has imbued a sense of humanity into a crisis that today can often get absorbed more with statistics than with stories. But far less is known of the activities and achievements of the many women who have acted alongside the more prominent voices, behind the scenes or in the wider crusades. Dig a little deeper into those state records and you will find traces of the influence of women scientists on the formation of reef conservation entities from about the mid to the late 20th century. Traces of leadership by women like this, pioneering scientists such as marine biologist Izzy Bennett, zoologist and taxonomist Pat Mather, who helped to establish Gabrumpa, and women of firsts, the one on the left there, Dorothy Hill. So she was the first female professor at Australian University, that's UQ, and she was the first female president of the Australian Academy of Science. Now, those traces in the record allude to what historian Lynn Abrams terms a bigger story about the progress of women in the post-war era. Pre-war too, in Hill's case, she's got an absolutely incredible CV. But that's partly a story about the expansion of tertiary education in Australia, particularly from the 50s and the 60s, and then of growing numbers of women in STEM, which is a time in the 60s when Rachel Carson's Silent Spring reached our shores, when a young Carden Wallace, for example, was studying under Professor Hill. Yet insofar as those state records represent a set of historical, material and ideological practices, they tend to raise more questions than provide answers about these women's influence. But this is also a bigger story about the tensions between the public achievements of men and the private lives of women. Alison Buist, who you can see pictured in the middle there, was the wife of environmentalist John, who led that Save the Reef campaign in the 60s. Alison was good friends with Dame Zara Holt, on the right here, the political wife of Australia's 17th Prime Minister, Harold. So while John buttonholed Harold in Canberra, reportedly telling him to save this bloody reef, what were Alison and Zara's conversations about? What might their friendship reveal of their support, ideas, and effort for the prominent men in their lives? These are the kinds of questions we're interested in too. With our snowball interviewing approach, and even with fewer than 50 oral histories recorded so far, although there's a lot of women on our list, we can tell you these are histories told by women who understand the reef in ways that are both distinctive and intersectional, thank you, sorry, and which remind us that we must continually actually interrogate our own subject positions as we go. From the crucial voices of First Nation women as authoritative holders of reef knowledge, to the endeavours of women from across the sciences, plural, through the arts and humanities, to the artists, writers, activists and politicians, and onto the struggles of public servants, people in the unions, and much more. This is not a chronology of achievement. To come to know these women, we must appreciate also their affection for and their very diverse experiential knowledges of the reef. These are women for whom the reef has a transformative fluency, a communicative capacity that carries in it important messages. And to understand that fluency requires deeper knowledge and attentive listening for them and for us. Certainly, in marine science, we are hearing how the personal is political for women who are navigating the structural characteristics of disadvantage. But actually, we want to recover a much more inclusive understanding of how difficult it's been for women to undertake any research, really, to borrow that phrase from Carden Wallace, in this very special place. We've begun to write about this with a first article out in this special edition of Queensland Review, co-edited by Kerrie and reef historian Ian McElmain last year. And our key point there was to make plain, through Carden's story, the ways that these achievements of women cannot be fully apprehended without also considering the private sphere. For example, back in the 70s, Wallace went globetrotting, museum globetrotting. She was doing COTS research, and so she was going to all these museums around the world. And as we can see here, her fortune was to have private champions who supported her challenge to gender norms of the time. As a young mother and a scientist who could continue her work. Because for many others of her generation, the motherhood penalty meant, and sometimes still means, that professional careers are abandoned or become simply too difficult to juggle with the incredible responsibility of care. Indeed, care is at the very heart of this story for so many women, and certainly for this one here, Alison Rickett. So she's a social scientist. She completed a degree in the sciences, plural, in psychology and biology at the ANU in the late 60s. Together with her partner, she helped establish 2 vital research field stations on the reef at One Tree Island and at Lizard. Yet Ali recalls that her own scientific career took a turn after the birth of their first child, When her partner didn't take too well to being a dad, that's a quote from her, the pair split up and she took their 14-month-old baby back here to Cairns. She landed a job with Gabrumpa, travelling up and down the coast. And here we have a story of two mothers helping each other with childcare so that they could stay involved in reef conservation. Here also are two women who are actively seeking out ways to diversify the knowledge we have about the reef. They want diverse responses to reef conservation in the work they're doing too. And here the method and scholarly discipline of oral history can help us to understand just how women live with their own story over time. Or, as we can see here, Ali sees herself quite differently in a later interview, not only sharing her pride at just how far so many women have come in science, but also recalling her departure from an academic career path as the casualty of a broken marriage and having a small baby to look after. The support structure simply wasn't there for a single mother in the 1970s. I'm not convinced it's here just yet, but it's come a long way. Nor was there a career path, and this is important too, for a social scientist who sought to engage with communities rather than taxonomy, for a communicative compassion that actually is generative and that opens up the potential for insight to expand our resources for action. And she wanted to do that work in the 70s, and there was just no place for it that she could find. So, in the feminist embrace of oral history, we seek a broader and deeper understanding of women's engagement in the reef. We think this work is necessary to uncover the rest of the story, to expand the repertoire of responses that we have to climate crisis, and to value the richness, depth, and diversity of stories of reef conservation and care. Thanks very much.